Millionaire CEO dining alone discovers ex-wife begging with identical quadruplets. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The clink of polished silver against fine bone china echoed softly in the muted grandeur of Lucille, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant perched high on the 65th floor. Beneath a canopy of soft golden lights, Graham Whitaker sat alone at a corner table set for two, his reflection fractured in the gleam of the panoramic glass wall that overlooked the sprawling city. His suit was perfectly pressed, his cufflinks discreetly branded, and his glass of single malt scotch barely touched. Everything about Graham exuded quiet power and practiced restraint, the kind worn like armor after decades of climbing to the top. He was by all standards a success. CEO of Whitaker Global Holdings, a multinational powerhouse with operations across 4 continents. A name that moved markets and silenced boardrooms. And yet here he was, alone. Outside, the city pulsed with light and life. Yellow cabs darted between lanes like fireflies, and pedestrians, tiny from this height, rushed through their evening with purpose. Graham watched them with a kind of detached reverence, wondering what it must feel like to be a part of the crowd. To belong. The waiter approached quietly. "Would you care for dessert, Mr. Whitaker?" Graham didn't look up. "No, thank you. Just the check." "Of course." As the waiter retreated, Graham reached for his glass, then paused mid-motion. A flicker of movement outside the window caught his attention. A cluster of figures standing near the curb, just below, beneath the glowing halo of a flickering street lamp. He squinted. A woman. Her coat was thin and frayed, her posture weary. She held a cardboard sign close to her chest, as though trying to protect its words from the wind. And beside her, for children, boys. They were huddled together, each wearing a jacket that had clearly seen too many winters, their heads bowed against the chill. Graham's breath caught. It couldn't be, but it was. Even from 10 floors up, even through a pane of Rain Street glass, he knew that profile, that posture, that presence. Elise, his ex-wife, the woman he hadn't seen in 6 years, the woman he had once imagined growing old beside, the woman he had let walk away when he chose ambition over connection, when he chose boardrooms over bedrooms filled with laughter. She was supposed to be in Chicago, or maybe Denver, or perhaps somewhere far from his world of tailored suits and calculated risk. He had lost track, willfully perhaps, and the children, the boys clustered around her. They couldn't be more than 5. But it wasn't their age that chilled his blood. It was their faces. Each one of them carried a feature of his own. The deep-set eyes, the defined jawline, that distinctive swirl of hair at the temple. He stood, nearly knocking over the glass. "Mr. Whitaker." The waiter appeared again, startled. "I need to go," Graham said, his voice unsteady. He pulled several bills from his wallet and dropped them on the table. "Keep the change." He didn't wait for an elevator. He took the stairs down 12 flights until he found one already descending, unable to stand the thought of delay. By the time he reached the street, the cold hit him like a slap. And then he saw her again. Closer now. Real. She was kneeling beside one of the boys, adjusting a mismatched mitten. Her movements were tender, practiced. Her face, though thinner and wearier, was unmistakably Elise. And the boys. God, the boys. He stepped forward, heart in his throat. "Elise." She froze. The boy beside her looked up, startled. Slowly, Elise turned. Her eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in something closer to fear. Graham. He couldn't speak. He could only look. From her face to the 4 children now staring up at him with cautious curiosity. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a rasp in the wind. "I could ask you the same," he managed. "I saw you from upstairs." "Elise, who are they?" She swallowed hard, drawing the boys closer. "They're mine." His voice cracked. "Are they mine?" She didn't answer right away. Her silence said enough. The tallest boy took a step forward, standing just slightly in front of his brothers. Protectively, his eyes, identical to Graham's, stared up with a mixture of defiance and confusion. "Are you okay, Mom?" the boy asked. "Yes, Caleb," she said gently. This is someone I used to know. Graham's knees threatened to buckle. The names, the eyes, the realization. He looked at Elise. Why didn't you tell me? She wrapped an arm around the smallest boy, who looked like he was about to cry. We should talk, but not here. Come inside, Graham said, motioning toward the lobby. There's a restaurant across the street. Just for dinner. Please. She hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. Then, with a small nod, she gathered the boys and followed him. As they crossed the street, the wind picked up. One of the boys, Jude, she whispered, reached for Graham's hand without looking up. It was a small, unconscious gesture. It undid him completely. He squeezed back, the warmth of that tiny hand grounding him in a way no billion-dollar merger ever had. They entered the diner, a small place with red vinyl booze and a jukebox in the corner. It smelled of coffee and syrup and things that didn't pretend to be more than they were. And for the first time in 6 years, Graham Whitaker felt like he had stepped into something real. He had no answers, only questions. But he knew one thing as he watched the 4 boys settle into the booth, Elise sitting between them, her eyes on him like a shield against history. Everything was about to change. Forever. The city's pulse thundered in Graham's ears as he descended the high-rise in a blur of steel and silence. Elevators had never felt this slow, this suffocating. Every second ticking by was another breath he couldn't catch, another thought too large for language. Elise. For boys. Their eyes, his eyes. By the time the elevator doors sighed open into the marble-clad lobby of the Whitaker Tower, Graham was already halfway to the revolving doors, not noticing the doorman's startled call or the taxi waiting to whisk him to his next meeting. He didn't know what he was going to say, only that he had to say something. The air outside bit at his throat as he scanned the street. The wind had picked up since he last looked through the restaurant's towering glass window. Trash stirred in the gutters, headlights flickered across slick asphalt. But she was still there, Elise, leaning slightly forward, her coat wrapped around 4 small bodies huddled beside her. His heart crumpled. She hadn't changed much. Still that same gentle curve to her neck, the graceful tension in her shoulders. But there was a weight to her now, a quiet exhaustion in the way she held herself against the cold. And the boys. He stepped closer. The city noise dulled. Elise, he called, and it wasn't a name, it was a prayer. She turned slowly. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, time vanished. No sound, no wind, no traffic. Just the ache of recognition. Years collapsed into one suspended heartbeat. She straightened, subtly shifting so the boys were behind her. Protective, maternal. Graham, she said, his name a whisper swallowed by the wind. He took another step. Are they? She nodded. No hesitation. No denied. Just a single, solemn nod. And he felt it all at once. The weight, the wonder, the disbelief. He looked past her to the children, for boys in mismatched jackets, their faces drawn from the lines of his own. His jaw, his father's cheekbones, the same storm-colored eyes that stared back in the mirror every morning. I didn't know, he murmured, his voice breaking. I tried, Elise said, steady but soft. But your people, they made sure I couldn't reach you. He thought of Carla, his old assistant, efficient, ruthless, the firewall to his fortress. Why didn't you come to me directly? Because I was exhausted, Graham. I was pregnant. Alone. You were building your empire. I couldn't be another voice asking you to pause. The boys watched, wide-eyed and quiet, sensing the gravity in the air. One of them, slightly taller with a protective stance, stepped forward. Mommy, who's that? Elise turned, kneeling. Her hand cupped the boy's cheek. That's someone very important. Graham knelt too, the sidewalk cold beneath his knees. What's your name? The boy hesitated. James. Hi, James, Graham said, his voice trembling. I'm Graham. I think I'm your dad. Silence fell like snow. James looked at his mother, eyes searching. She nodded again, slowly. The other boys moved closer. 3 more copies of himself, each with a different spark. One clutched a threadbare dinosaur. Another peered curiously, and the last stood quietly, watching Graham with unnerving stillness. "Would you?" Graham cleared his throat. "Would you come have dinner with me? Somewhere warm. Please." Elise looked uncertain. Then she glanced at the boys, whose fingers were now red from cold, and nodded. "Just dinner," she said, not as a promise, but as a boundary. They walked 2 blocks in silence to a small family restaurant tucked into a side street. Nothing like the glass and gold elegance Graham was used to. The hostess gave him a strange look as they entered, but quickly pulled together a table. The boys were quiet at first. Graham sat across from them, his linen suit looking absurd in the vinyl booth. Elise beside them, her hand occasionally brushing a small shoulder. He studied them in the golden diner light. James, the eldest by minutes, clearly the protector. Noah, sharp-eyed, already reading the menu like a contract. Rowan, dreamy, staring at the spinning dessert carousel. How, smallest, watching everyone but saying nothing. "What do you like to eat?" Graham asked. "Mac and cheese," Rowan said. "With ketchup." Graham blinked. "With ketchup." All 4 nodded solemnly. "Make that 5, he told the waitress with a faint laugh. As the food arrived, the boys relaxed. Elise didn't say much. She seemed torn between observation and protection. Graham watched James carefully cut his meal and share his roll with Theo. Watched Noah whisper facts to Rowan about how ketchup was originally a fish sauce. Listened to Rowan hum something tuneless. And when Theo finally reached across the table and took Graham's napkin by mistake, Graham handed it over wordlessly and smiled. "They're remarkable," he said quietly. Elise softened just slightly. "They're everything." He nodded. "I miss so much." She didn't answer. Didn't need to. After dinner, as they prepared to leave, Theo tugged at his coat. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" he asked, eyes huge. Graham knelt again. His voice cracked. "If you want me to be." Theo nodded and slipped his tiny hand into Graham's. It was not forgiveness. It was not yet love. But it was a beginning. Outside, the wind had died. Elise pulled the boys close and glanced at Graham. "Same time tomorrow?" He nodded, blinking back tears. "Same time tomorrow." And for the first time in years, Graham Whitaker walked into the night, not as a man alone, but as a father beginning again. Graham Whitaker stood silently by the tall glass window of his penthouse, staring out at the glittering lights of New York City. The untouched glass of red wine in his hand caught the dim glow of the chandelier, the deep crimson liquid trembling slightly with the weight of his thoughts. The unexpected encounter with Elise and the 4 little boys, his sons, had stirred something in him he thought long buried. Memories of Elise washed over him like a tide. The way she used to laugh without holding back, how she would trace lazy circles on his back when he was too tense to sleep, the warmth of her presence that always grounded him. But he'd let her slip away. No, he had pushed her away in the name of ambition. And now, 6 years later, he'd come face to face with not only the woman he'd lost, but the sons he never knew existed. The next morning, Graham woke early, but not out of habit or work-related stress. It was purpose. For the first time in years, he felt the tremor of nervous anticipation. He reached out to Elise, his voice tentative but steady, and asked if he could see the boys again. After a long pause, Elise agreed. They would meet that afternoon at Central Park. By 2 p.m., Graham was already at the park, early of course, pacing near the lake where kids played, laughing and shouting as the crisp air carried their joy. His heart pounded with a kind of fear he wasn't used to. Business deals, international mergers, those were predictable. But this was fragile. And then he saw them. Elise walking with quiet strength, holding Jude's small hand. Caleb, the eldest by posture if not by age, kept pace beside her. Micah was pointing excitedly at a squirrel, while Rowan seemed more interested in the pattern of leaves on the ground. Each boy moved differently, yet unmistakably carried something of him. The chin, the eyes, the brow. Graham smiled and knelt down as they approached. "Hi there," he said gently, eyes meeting each of theirs. "What would you guys like to do today?" The boys looked to Elise first. She nodded, giving them the space to choose. "Play soccer?" Caleb asked, his voice low but firm. "I brought a ball," Graham said, lifting it from the bag behind him. "Let's play." The first few minutes were stiff. The boys kept their distance. Graham made sure not to push, not to overreach. He laughed at himself when he tripped over the grass and fell, making Rowan giggle for the first time. Slowly, trust began to grow. By the time they took a break under the shade of an old oak tree, Graham felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He handed out snacks from a cloth bag, just simple granola bars and apples, but the boys lit up like it was a feast. They sat in a small circle on the grass. Micah looked up with curious eyes. "What do you do for work?" Graham chuckled. "I run a big company," he said honestly. "But the most important job I've ever had is being your dad." Rowan tilted his head. "Do you like to draw?" "I do. I draw dragons." "I love dragons," Graham said with a smile. "Maybe you can teach me some time?" Rowan beamed. "Okay." Jude, the quietest of the four, had been watching him silently the whole time. Now, he finally whispered, "Are you going to leave again?" Graham's breath caught. He turned to Elise, who said nothing, but her eyes, soft and guarded, were on him. He knelt beside Jude. "I can't change the past," he said gently, voice cracking just a little. "But I promise I'll do everything I can to stay. I want to be here. For you. For your brothers. For your mom." There was a beat of silence. And then Jude nodded. As the sun began its descent, Elise stood and gently gathered the boys. "It's time to go," she said softly. Graham stood too, reluctant to let the moment end. "Can I see you again tomorrow?" Caleb looked to Elise, then back at Graham. "We come to the park again," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll be here," Graham said, his voice full of something deeper than gratitude. "I'll be waiting." As they walked away, Graham watched them, a fragile hope blooming in his chest. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was a beginning, one he wasn't going to waste. For the first time in years, Graham Whitaker felt his life slowly being rebuilt, not with steel and glass, but with laughter, small hands, and the echo of footsteps he now never wanted to miss again. The first days of fatherhood. Graham Whitaker stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his light blue sweater. Today, he had deliberately chosen something simple, leaving behind his usual high-end suits. He wanted to look approachable, not like the CEO of a multinational conglomerate. His heart pounded with anticipation. He was about to spend the afternoon with the four sons he had only recently discovered were his. He arrived at Central Park earlier than planned, settling on a soft green patch of grass near the lake where children often played. In his hands was a picnic basket filled with sandwiches, fruit, and juice boxes. He wanted to make the day feel light, warm, and welcoming. From a distance, he saw Elise approaching with Caleb, Micah, Rowan, and Jude. Each boy had his own unique presence, but all shared one undeniable feature: the same deep blue eyes Graham saw in the mirror every morning. "Hi, kids," Graham greeted them with a smile, trying to mask the nervous edge in his voice. Dad," Micah replied hesitantly. The word Dad hit Graham like a silent thunderclap. It was the first time he had heard it from any of his sons, and it landed with both sweetness and sorrow. "Shall we sit?" "I brought lunch for everyone," Graham suggested, gesturing to the picnic spread. They settled down on the grass. Elise helped the boys unpack the food. The atmosphere was a bit stiff at first, but as the sunlight warmed the park and the scent of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches drifted in the breeze, things began to soften. "Dad, what do you like to do when you're not working?" Rowan asked, curiosity bright in his eyes. Graham paused thoughtfully. "I like to read and go for walks. But I think from now on, my favorite thing will be spending time with you all." Jude, usually the quietest, surprised them by speaking up. "Do you know how to play chess?" Graham smiled. "I do, but I'm not very good at it. Maybe you can teach me." Jude nodded, and a small, proud smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. After lunch, Graham suggested, "Would you like to try boating on the lake? There's a rental stand nearby." Caleb looked at Elise for a cue, and she gave him an encouraging nod. On the small rowboat, Graham took the oars while the boys giggled and pointed at ducks paddling by. Micah leaned over the edge trying to touch the water, sending a small splash over Rowan, who shrieked in delight. "Careful, Micah," Graham warned, though his voice was laced with affection, not scolding. After the boat ride, They made their way to a nearby ice cream stand. Graham bought each of the boys their favorite flavor, which Elise had thoughtfully mentioned during dinner a few nights ago. They sat together on a park bench, ice cream dripping down chins and onto tiny hands. "Next time, can we go to the zoo?" Caleb asked, his eyes hopeful. Graham nodded without hesitation. "I'd love that. We can make a whole day of it." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Elise glanced at her watch. "It's time to head home, boys." Graham felt a quiet ache inside him. "Can I see you again this weekend?" Rowan looked up and smiled. "We come here every Saturday afternoon." "I'll be here," Graham replied, his voice soft with gratitude. As they walked back toward the park entrance, Elise touched Graham's arm lightly. "Thank you for today." They were so happy. Graham turned to her, eyes glistening. "No, thank you for raising them, for giving them so much love when I wasn't there to do my part." She didn't say anything in return, just offered him a quiet, heartfelt smile. In that smile, Graham felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning, a first thread in the fabric of a family he was finally starting to sew back together. What blood cannot hide. The envelope lay on the edge of Graham's oak desk, sealed with the weight of every unanswered question that had kept him awake for nights. The stark white of it contrasted sharply with the deep grain of the wood, like a whisper against thunder. It wasn't large, just a standard legal-sized envelope, but its presence was a storm in his chest. Wallace had dropped it off that morning, his mouth tight with suspicion and eyes filled with something Graham couldn't name. Fear, perhaps, or a kind of brotherly protectiveness warped by years of silent judgment. "You need to know for sure before you start rewriting your life," Wallace had said, placing the envelope down like a verdict. "Don't be a fool, Graham." And yet, for the first time in years, Graham didn't feel like a fool. He felt alive. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. Instead, he sat in the dim light of his study, watching raindrops streak down the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment. Manhattan blurred behind them, steel, glass, and stories built on ambition. So much of his life had been erected in that image. Imposing, impenetrable, until four small boys had looked up at him with eyes identical to his. Graham had spent the last 2 weeks orbiting Elise and the boys. Every shared laugh, every spilled juice box, every bedtime story had carved new grooves into his life. The city didn't feel quite so sharp anymore. His penthouse no longer echoed as much. But Wallace's words haunted him. What if they're not yours? He had thought about that, of course he had. But doubt hadn't sprouted from his own heart. It had been planted from the outside. Elise had never asked him for a dime. Not once. No demands. No drama. Just that quiet, weary look in her eyes as she handed over a backpack of snacks and told the boys, "Have fun with G." He sighed and picked up the envelope. He didn't tear it open. Instead, he turned it over in his hands, letting the texture of the paper ground him. He remembered the first time he'd met Elise, how she laughed with her whole face, how her fingertips had brushed against his sleeve when she was nervous. He remembered the fights, too, the way she'd walked away 6 years ago, not out of hatred, but something worse, heartbreak. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marta, his housekeeper, poked her head in. "Mr. Whitaker, there's a woman downstairs." She said her name is Elise. His heart tripped. "Send her up," he said, standing quickly. When the elevator doors opened moments later, Elise stepped out like a ghost reborn. Her coat was damp from the rain, her cheeks flushed with the chill. She clutched her purse as if it were armor. "I shouldn't have come," she said without preamble. "I'm glad you did," he replied softly. They stood in silence, the air between them taut. "I wanted to tell you something before anything changes," Elise said, her voice trembling. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "I didn't keep them from you because I hated you," she began. "I kept them from you because I didn't think you had room for them. Or for me. You were chasing something I couldn't follow." Graham looked at her then, not just at her face, but at the exhaustion behind her eyes, the fear lined around her mouth. "You were right," he said. "About that time in my life. I wasn't ready." "I wasn't either," she admitted. "But I became ready because I had to." There was a long pause before she added, You didn't ask for this. But they love you already. Jude asked if you could come to his classes, show, and share. He wants to show you off. Graham felt something fracture in him, a crack through a stone fortress that had long stood cold and unmoved. I haven't opened it, he said, holding up the envelope. Her eyes followed the motion, lips parting slightly. I don't need it to tell me what I already know, he continued. Elise's eyes shimmered. You should still open it. Not for you. For them. So that when someone asks, you can say it out loud without doubt. He nodded. With slow hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the page inside. It was clinical, cold, a match, 99.9999% probability. Caleb, Micah, Rowan, Jude, his sons. He looked up at Elise. Her eyes were fixed on his, as if searching for something. He offered her the paper. She shook her head. I already knew. They sat in silence for a long while, the rain now softening against the windows like the heartbeat of a city that, for once, could wait. Finally, Graham stood. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, like a man not in worship, but in surrender. I will not be absent again, he said. Not for a second. Not if I can help it. Elise reached forward then, a single tear slipping down her cheek as her hand found his. I never stopped hoping you'd say that. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Wallace, not the company, not even time. Only truth. Only love. Only the beginning of a second chance. The envelope lay discarded on the desk, its message redundant. Graham didn't need science to tell him who he was. He already knew. He was a father, and he was finally ready to become one. The confirmation and the choice. Graham Whitaker stood at the edge of his office window, overlooking a city he once believed he had conquered. The sky was overcast, thick clouds swallowing the tops of glass towers. In his hand was a crisp manila envelope with the seal of the private genetics lab. He had personally chosen. The results inside were conclusive, undeniable. Caleb, Micah, Rowan, and Jude were his sons. He had read the report a dozen times, yet each word still hit with the weight of a revelation. There was no margin of error, no room for doubt. He had children, 4 sons. The magnitude of that truth reshaped the architecture of his world. Behind him, Wallace paced. So that's it then, Wallace muttered. You're a father. Officially. Graham didn't answer. He was still trying to absorb what that word meant beyond its clinical definition. It wasn't the DNA that mattered. It was the spaghetti stains on their shirts, the wide-eyed wonder at dinosaur bones, the tiny hands reaching up to him when they were afraid. You know what this means, don't you? Wallace continued, voice sharp. Elise has a permanent place in your life now. Those kids, they come with needs. Time, money, attention. You can't run a global empire while playing house in Central Park. Graham turned. Don't call it playing house. Then what is it? A midlife crisis dressed in Oshkosh overalls. The words landed like slaps. But Graham didn't react with anger. Instead, he looked at his brother and saw the fear behind the cruelty. Wallace had always feared loss. Loss of power. Loss of structure. Loss of control. They're my sons, Graham said quietly. They are not a detour. They're the road. Wallace scoffed. That road doesn't end in profit. It ends in meaning, Graham replied. That evening, Graham found himself outside Elise's modest apartment. She opened the door before he knocked, as if she had been waiting. You got the results. He nodded. Elise stepped aside. The boys were in the living room, building a sprawling Lego city. Caleb glanced up, gave a curt nod, then returned to overseeing construction. Graham knelt beside them. What's you building? A zoo, said Micah. But with dragons. Can I help? Rowan looked up, a sly grin forming. Only if you build the dragon cage. Graham chuckled. Deal. As they played, Elise stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching, measuring. After the boys went to bed, Elise poured tea into chipped mugs. Graham held his in both hands, as if trying to warm something deeper than skin. They're amazing, he said. They are, and they've been fine without you. I know, but I want to be here now. She didn't speak for a long time. What about Whitaker Global? Wallace. Graham set the mug down. I could delegate. Step back. Elise raised an eyebrow. You? Step back? From the company you built from scratch. He met her gaze. I'd rather miss a board meeting than miss another birthday. The next weeks unfolded like a chapter Graham had never known existed. After years of sterile boardrooms and red-eye flights, his calendar now featured playground visits, parent-teacher meetings, and bedtime stories. He learned the different ways each boy hugged him, the way Jude leaned in for reassurance, how Rowan demanded piggyback rides, the cautious warmth in Caleb, Micah's endless questions. Every moment brought joy and guilt. Joy for what he was discovering, guilt for what he had missed. Wallace, meanwhile, was relentless. You can't run an empire part-time, he snapped during a strategy meeting. Investors are nervous. Let them be, Graham replied. I'm not stepping down. I'm just stepping aside. He installed a COO he trusted, shifted major decision-making, and established a new schedule in the office 3 days a week. Afternoons and weekends were reserved. The board called it unconventional. Wallace called it reckless. Graham called it living. One rainy Thursday, Caleb had a nightmare and called for him. Graham drove across the city at 3 a.m., hair damp and heart pounding. He sat beside the boy's bed, stroking his hair, whispering stories until the tremor stopped. In that quiet, Graham whispered the truth he hadn't said aloud. I'm sorry I wasn't there, but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. A small hand slipped into his. That was the only answer he needed. On a Sunday, the boys held a tea party for their stuffed animals. Graham wore a paper crown and pretended his tea was as important as any deal he'd brokered in London or Shanghai. Elise watched from the kitchen, her expression softening more with each passing week. Something was rebuilding between them. Not romance, not yet, but a mutual respect anchored by shared love. At the end of the day, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the boys snored in unison, Graham sat beside her on the fire escape. I used to think success meant building something so big, so unshakable, that no one could ever take it away. Elise looked at him, and now I think success is holding something so gently, it chooses to stay. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The path was no longer paved in gold. It was lined with crayons, tiny shoes, and 4 laughter-filled voices calling him by a name he had never earned, but now cherished more than anything. Dad, the fountain of truth. The autumn air held a kind of stillness that only arrived in early October, when the leaves were caught in that quiet, golden hesitation before the full fall. Graham Whitaker stood beside the Bethesda fountain in Central Park, watching the water spill gently into the pool below. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow on the stone angel above, her wings forever poised mid-flight. Elise arrived a few minutes later, guiding 4 small figures beside her. Caleb walked a step ahead, his shoulders squared with silent resolve. Micah clung to Elise's hand. Rowan skipped along the path, humming something only he could hear, and Jude, as always, brought up the rear, glancing everywhere as if cataloging the world in slow motion. Graham's heart stumbled a little when he saw them. Not out of shock. He'd spent every afternoon with them these past weeks, but because every time they somehow looked more like him, as if time was catching up to the truth that none of them had yet dared speak aloud. They've been asking questions, Elise said softly when they reached him. Her eyes met his with a quiet urgency. It's time. They sat together on a blanket Elise had brought, under the shade of a turning maple tree. Graham helped pass out juice boxes and sandwiches as the boys settled, their chatter slowly dissolving into curiosity. We need to tell you something important today, Elise began gently. Something about who we are and who you are. For pairs of blue eyes turned toward them. Graham noticed how Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious, perhaps even afraid. Micah's brow furrowed. Rowan stopped chewing. Jude simply blinked and waited. Do you remember when you asked why you don't have a dad like some of your friends do? Elise continued, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The truth is, you do. A silence dropped, not heavy, but deep, like water settling after a stone. Graham leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. I'm your dad, he said quietly. I didn't know about you for a long time, but now I do, and I want to be here, if you'll let me. Caleb stood up abruptly. You're saying? You're him. Graham nodded. Yes. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. Then where were you? When Mom had to work 2 jobs. When Jude was sick and we had to sleep in the car. Where were you? Graham's voice cracked before it even formed. I didn't know. Elise tried, but I didn't get the messages. I didn't see. Caleb turned away. Micah crawled into Elise's lap, silent tears running down his cheeks. Rowan looked between them, confused. Jude walked to Graham and sat beside him. You brought me Legos, Jude said simply. And you read the book about the brave bear. Graham smiled through his own wet eyes. I did. I think you're nice, Jude whispered. Are you going to stay? Graham nodded. I want to. Forever if I can. Micah sniffled. Will you come to the Halloween parade? I wouldn't miss it. Rowan, still holding his sandwich, scooted closer. If you're our dad, does that mean we can call you Dad? Graham's heart nearly gave out. If you want to, but only if it feels right. There was another long pause. Then Caleb turned around. His face was wet, his cheeks flushed. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said. Not now. Maybe not ever. Graham stood slowly and walked to him, kneeling to his level. You don't have to. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I'll be here. Whether you call me Dad or not. I'll still be here. Caleb looked down at his shoes. Then, with a small nod, he whispered, You better be. The moment didn't end in fireworks. It ended in stillness, quiet, aching, human stillness. But something changed that day. Not everything was healed, but the wound had finally been acknowledged. As they packed up, Rowan handed Graham a drawing he'd made during lunch. It showed 6 stick figures holding hands in front of a fountain. One of them had glasses. One had a beard. One was holding a teddy bear. One had a blue balloon. 2 taller ones stood in the middle, smiling. That's you, Rowan said, pointing to the man with the beard. Graham looked at the drawing for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Elise stood beside him as the boys ran ahead, chasing falling leaves. It wasn't perfect, she said quietly, but it was real. That's all I want, Graham replied. Real. And as they walked home, the sun dipped low behind the skyline. The city pulsed around them. But inside that one family, something had finally begun to heal. The quiet revolution of love. The first time Graham Whitaker packed 4 lunchboxes in a row, each with a tiny note and a sticker of the boys' favorite animals, he realized something startling. His hands were trembling. Not from anxiety, not from fatigue, but from reverence. Reverence for the mundane, for the extraordinary weight of peanut butter sandwiches and juice boxes labeled with love. He stood in Elise's modest kitchen, morning sun streaming through the lace curtains, and looked at the 4 mismatched lunch bags as if they were priceless artifacts. Caleb liked his apple slices peeled. Micah needed his sandwich cut in triangles. Rowan only drank the red juice boxes. And Jude refused crusts. Details Graham had learned not by asking Elise, but by listening to the boys, by watching, remembering. It was, he thought, what real fathers do. He wasn't CEO this morning. Not the man who once negotiated oil contracts in 5 time zones before breakfast. No, he was simply Dad. They're going to love it, Elise said from behind, watching him. Graham turned. She was holding one sock in her hand, the other probably still missing in the great mystery that was laundry. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her smile was weary but warm. Familiar. I hope so, he murmured. The front door burst open as Caleb dashed in, followed by Micah and Rowan. Jude wandered in last, clutching a crayon drawing of a dinosaur family. Are you driving us today, G? Rowan asked. G. That's what they called him now. Short for Graham, but it had started to feel like something sacred, like the beginning of something new. Yep, he said, grabbing the car keys. Seat belts and snacks are ready. Let's go. At the school gate, other parents lingered with coffee cups and phones. Graham bent down to adjust Jude's backpack. You coming for career day next week? Caleb asked, squinting at him under the morning sun. Wouldn't miss it. Jude leaned in and whispered, You can talk about being a super dad. Graham laughed, blinking fast to hide the sudden moisture in his eyes. Maybe I will. That evening, after dropping the boys home, he stayed. He always stayed now. Elise handed him a dish towel as they stood shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen, washing and drying dishes. "You're different," she said quietly. Graham didn't look up. "I feel different. They trust you. Not because of what you say, but because you show up. Every day." He turned to her. "Thank you for letting me try." She met his eyes. "You're not trying anymore, Graham. You're doing." The week passed in a blur of bedtime stories, laundry mishaps, Lego skyscrapers, and one unfortunate incident involving Jude, peanut butter, and the dog. Career day came. Graham wore a navy sweater instead of his usual suit. He stood in front of a group of 5-year-olds and their parents, holding up a drawing of 4 stick figures, his boys, and tried to explain what he did. "I used to think being a CEO was the most important job in the world," he said. "But then I met 4 little boys who taught me what really matters. Now, I work at loving them well. It's harder than any board meeting, and far more rewarding." Caleb beamed. Micah whispered, "He's the best G ever." Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Elise found Graham sitting on the back porch, sipping tea. "You look like a man who's just climbed a mountain," she teased. He smiled. "Feels like it." She sat beside him. The air was crisp with early spring. "I missed 5 years," he said, "but I don't want to miss a single moment more." "You're not," she said. "Not anymore." He turned to her, unsure if it was the porch light or her eyes that held the warmth he felt. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between them was full of forgiveness. In those quiet weeks, Graham learned the rhythm of their lives. He learned how Jude slept with his hand curled around a stuffed fox, that Caleb had nightmares about being lost, that Micah hated loud noises, that Rowan liked to hum when he built things. He learned how to braid Elise's hair when her fingers were too tired, how to cook grilled cheese without burning it, how to say no to work and yes to bedtime cuddles. And, slowly, something inside him began to stitch itself back together. The empire he'd built meant little now. What mattered were the tiny arms that wrapped around his neck, the whispered goodnight G through, the half-open door, the way Elise looked at him now, not as the man she left, but the father he was becoming. It wasn't a life he had planned. It was better. One Saturday afternoon, they went to the farmer's market. The boys ran ahead, giggling. A stranger approached Graham, an older man with kind eyes. "Your grandkids?" he asked. Graham laughed. "No. My sons." The man raised an eyebrow. All four. All 4. You're a lucky man." Graham nodded. "I am. More than I deserve." He caught Elise's smile from a distance, sunlight in her hair, and the laughter of their sons floating through the air. For the first time in decades, Graham Whitaker was exactly where he needed to be. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had once had everything and still felt empty, that this, right here, was the only kind of wealth that ever truly mattered. A test of trust and the final choice. After months of gradually integrating himself into Elise's world and into the lives of their 4 sons, Graham Whitaker felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was truly becoming a father. The morning drop-offs at school, the bedtime stories, the quiet laughter during family dinners, all of it had become sacred to him in ways he never expected. But shadows from the past have a habit of lingering, and one such shadow was about to challenge everything he thought he was building. Late one afternoon, while Graham was helping Elise prepare dinner, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. Wallace Whitaker. Graham's heart sank a little. He answered, trying to sound neutral. "Hey, Wallace. We need to talk. Tonight." Wallace's voice was clipped urgent. Graham sighed. "Where?" "Cafe Morley. 7 sharp." Graham arrived to find Wallace already seated, a thick envelope lying untouched on the table in front of him. His brother's face was tight, the way it always was before delivering difficult truths. "What's this?" Graham asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Wallace pushed the envelope forward. "You should look through it." Elise had been preparing to file for full custody of the boys. She's had the paperwork drafted for months. Graham's stomach turned as he opened the envelope and read through the neatly compiled documents. Legal filings, notes, drafts of custody agreements. The air in the cafe felt suddenly too thick. "She never filed this," Graham said quietly. "Not yet," Wallace emphasized. "She's waiting." watching, maybe waiting for you to walk away from your fortune before she makes her move. Graham looked up at his brother, sadness flickering behind his eyes. Wallace, I know you think you're protecting me, but I don't think that's what this is. If Elise had wanted to shut me out, she could have done it long ago. She's testing you, Wallace said, seeing how far you'll go. Maybe she's hoping you'll cave in and hand her everything. I think she's hoping I'll prove I'm serious, Graham replied. And I am. Wallace leaned back, clearly unconvinced. You're betting everything you've built on a woman who left you and 4 kids you didn't even know existed. I'm not betting, Graham said. I'm choosing. For once in my life, I'm choosing something that matters more than numbers. Later that night, Graham returned home. He found Elise folding laundry in the living room, the soft hum of the boys' bedtime voices drifting in from down the hall. We need to talk, he said gently. She looked up cautious. What is it? Wallace gave me the custody paperwork, Graham said evenly. The ones you drafted but never filed. Elise froze for a beat, then set the towel down. I was scared, Graham. You showed up out of nowhere, and I didn't know what to believe. I didn't know if you'd disappear again once the novelty wore off. You didn't file them, he said, walking closer. That tells me everything I need to know. Elise's eyes filled. I needed to see if you were real, if you were going to stay. I'm here, he said, and I've made a decision. Elise blinked. What decision? I'm stepping down as CEO. Effective immediately. I want to be present, truly present, for our sons. I want to build something with them I can never build in a boardroom. Tears fell freely now, but they weren't from fear. They were the tears of a woman who had carried too much, alone, for too long. The next morning, Graham called an emergency board meeting at Whitaker Global Holdings. Executives filled the sleek glass conference room, murmuring among themselves. Wallace sat at the end of the table, arms crossed, already anticipating what was to come. Graham stood at the head. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm but firm, I've spent the last 20 years building this company, and I am proud of what we've achieved. But today I'm stepping down as CEO. A stunned silence followed. Then gasps. Questions. Wallace shot to his feet. Graham. I'm not disappearing, Graham continued. I will remain on the board in an advisory role, but I need to step back from the daily grind. I have 4 sons, and I've already missed 5 years of their lives. I don't intend to miss another day. The meeting adjourned in uneasy silence. Later that afternoon, Graham returned to the apartment. The boys were playing in the tiny backyard, laughter echoing through the alleyway. Elise stood at the kitchen window, watching him with wary eyes. He walked over to where Caleb was building a tower of sticks and rocks. I'm home, Graham said. Caleb looked up. It's still daytime, he said suspiciously. Graham chuckled. Yeah, I'm going to be home a lot more now. Micah ran up and threw his arms around his leg. Forever. Forever, Graham promised, his voice thick with emotion. He looked up at Elise, who was standing in the doorway now, arms folded. I told the board today, he said. I'm done being CEO. She stepped forward slowly. You're really doing this? Graham nodded. I want this. I want us. I want them. Elise reached out and took his hand. No more meetings? She teased gently. Only tea parties, he grinned, nodding toward the boys' pretend kitchen. They stood there together, the early autumn sun casting soft shadows on the walls behind them. 2 people who had failed each other once, standing on the edge of something new. Something worth everything. Reconciliation, rebuilding on broken ground. After months of trying and learning, Graham and Elise sat across from each other in a law office, an elegant space bathed in soft, natural light. Before them lay the co-parenting agreement, a document outlining not just legal responsibilities and rights, but a quiet testimony of growth and commitment for themselves and their 4 sons. Elise held the pen, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked at Graham, her eyes filled with emotion. Are you sure about this? She asked softly, seriously. Graham nodded, gently placing his hand over hers. We come a long way to get here, he said. I want us to raise them together, with love and respect. Elise smiled faintly, and together they signed. When the ink dried, they exchanged a glance not of victory or defeat, but of understanding, a silent promise for the future. The first steps, Leaving the law office, Graham and Elise took the boys to Central Park to celebrate in their own simple way. At the park, Caleb, Micah, Rowan, and Jude ran freely, their laughter ringing out across the open space like music. Graham sat down on a bench beside Elise, his eyes following the boys. "I know this wasn't easy for you," he said gently. Elise looked at him, warmth softening her features. "We're all learning, Graham," she replied. "What matters is that we're doing it together." A new opportunity. A few weeks later, Elise received a job offer from a respected interior design firm. The opportunity was exciting but brought worry. Could she balance work and the needs of 4 growing boys? One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Graham and Elise sat on the sofa, quietly going over the offer. "What do you think?" he asked. Elise sighed. "I want to accept it. I really do. But I'm scared. What if I can't be there for them the way they need?" "You're not alone anymore," Graham said. "We're a team. I'll help however I can. We'll figure it out together." With Graham's support, Elise took the job. It was the first time in years she had chosen a path for herself with confidence. Uncle Wallace. Meanwhile, Wallace, Graham's younger brother and former co-CEO, remained distant from Graham's new life. But one afternoon, Graham invited him over, hoping he might connect with the boys. Wallace arrived awkwardly, uncertain. But as soon as Micah, a curious, wide-eyed boy who loved numbers, started quizzing him on math puzzles, something clicked. "Uncle Wallace," Micah said eagerly, "can you help me solve this?" Wallace smiled for the first time in weeks. "Of course I can." From that day forward, Wallace became a regular visitor. He bonded especially with Micah, often bringing him books on astronomy, math puzzles, and brain teasers. Wallace began to understand. Family wasn't just a matter of obligation. It was about moments like these. Building forward. Time passed, and Graham and Elise slowly found their rhythm. They navigated co-parenting with open communication and mutual respect. One night, as they sat around the dinner table, Caleb looked up from his plate. "I like it when both of you are here," he said earnestly. Graham and Elise exchanged a look, one of shared pride, humility, and quiet joy. "We're not going anywhere," Graham promised. "We're your family. Always." In that moment, Graham realized that while the road ahead might still be winding, they had everything they needed to walk it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. House call home. The first morning in the new house, Graham Whitaker stood barefoot in the kitchen, still unsure if the creaking of old floorboards was real or simply the sound of his heart adjusting to a new rhythm. The modest 2-story brick home sat just 4 blocks from Elise's apartment, close enough for comfort, far enough to honor boundaries. It wasn't grand. The lawn was patchy, the paint a bit faded, and the kitchen appliances bore the wear of another family story. But for the first time in years, Graham felt something unfamiliar: peace. He brewed coffee in a chipped ceramic pot, the kind he would have once scoffed at in his penthouse days. Now it grounded him. Everything about this house was imperfect, lived in, and full of potential. Much like himself. That evening, Elise brought the boys over for dinner. A trial run, she called it, to see how things went. Graham had spent the entire day preparing. He'd cooked spaghetti from scratch, with some frantic mid-recipe phone calls to Elise, picked up a used dining table from a neighbor, and even found a half-broken Lego set at the thrift store down the street. When they arrived, the boys burst through the front door like a gust of wind. Caleb, ever the observer, walked slowly behind his brothers, taking in every corner with a quiet curiosity. "Smells good in here," Elise said, stepping into the kitchen. "It was supposed to be garlic bread," Graham muttered, lifting a slightly blackened tray from the oven. "It got enthusiastic." She laughed, and something in Graham's chest loosened. Dinner was chaos, laughter, and spaghetti sauce. Jude managed to tip his cup twice. Rowan insisted on telling a joke between every bite. Micah asked 3 questions about how water becomes steam, and Caleb, when he thought no one was looking, rested his cheek against Graham's shoulder for a long, quiet moment. After dinner, they piled into the living room. Graham had turned the den into a makeshift playroom, complete with hand-me-down bean bags and blankets. The boys gravitated toward the Lego set instantly, while Graham and Elise sank into the couch, side by side, but not quite touching. "They like it here," Elise said softly. "So do I," Graham replied. And he meant it, not in a temporary, polite way, but in the way a person means it when they realize their bones have finally stopped aching from loneliness. Caleb approached with a book in hand. "Will you read this, G?" he asked, using the nickname the boys had given him in cautious affection weeks earlier. Graham took the book and nodded. Of course. They all gathered around him, Elise included, as he read aloud. His voice stumbled at first, uncertain, but the boys listened intently, their heads resting on arms and each other, and by the last page, his voice had found its steady place in the room. After Elise tucked them into the makeshift guest bedroom upstairs, she lingered at the door. "They asked if they could stay over next weekend," she said. "Only if I get to make pancakes," Graham replied. She smiled. "Deal." As she turned to go, she paused. "You're good with them, Graham. Better than I ever imagined." "I'm just catching up," he said. "Every night I missed. I'm trying to meet them one by one." She didn't respond, but he saw it in her eyes. Forgiveness, or at least the shape of it, slowly forming. That weekend, the boys stayed over. They brought their stuffed animals, sleeping bags, and enough energy to light up the city. Graham learned how to braid Rowan's hair. "It makes me think better," Rowan claimed. "How to build a Lego space station with Jude, how to answer Micah's endless questions about planets, and how to decode Caleb's silences." They made pancakes with uneven edges and danced in the living room to 80s rock. Graham sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by plastic dinosaurs and crayon drawings, and felt richer than he ever had sitting at the head of a boardroom table. On Sunday night, when Elise came to pick them up, Caleb hugged Graham tightly. "Can we come back next weekend?" he asked. "Anytime you want," Graham said, kneeling to his level. "This is your home, too." As they drove away, Graham stood on the porch, arms crossed, heart full. The house behind him was quiet now, but not empty. Not anymore. Later, before bed, he walked through the living room. On the coffee table, a piece of paper caught his eye, a drawing in bold crayon. 5 stick figures under a crooked roof. For small ones, one taller. All of them smiling. Home. Graham sat on the couch, the drawing in his lap, and for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel like he was waiting for anything. He was already there. The Garden of Promises. The late afternoon sun blanketed the small backyard in warm golden light. Balloons bobbed lazily in the soft spring breeze, tangled among the branches of a maple tree just beginning to bloom. Laughter rang out, bright, wild, and echoing through the quiet residential street of the neighborhood Graham Whitaker now called home. 6 years old. For little boys with his eyes, his smile, and somehow their own rhythm, Graham stood near the picnic table that had been transformed into a birthday. Kingdom. Streamers woven like vines, a paper crown for each child, and cupcakes arranged in the shape of a number 6. He looked down at the small hand wrapped tightly around his fingers. Jude, the quietest of the 4, was staring up at him with a chocolate-smeared grin. "Dad," Jude said, tugging his hand gently. "Can we do the treasure hunt now?" "I think Rowan already found the first clue." Graham crouched, brushing a bit of frosting from the corner of Jude's mouth. "Absolutely, Captain Jude. Lead the way." Jude took off like a spark, calling for his brothers. Graham straightened and watched the chaos unfold. Micah shouting instructions, Rowan darting toward the flower bed, Caleb methodically analyzing a map drawn in crayon. Beside him, Elise laughed. The sound wrapped around him like something sacred. She wore a pale blue dress with a grass stain near the hem, her hair gathered in a loose braid. The lines of the last few years were still faint on her face, but they didn't harden her expression. They deepened it, like cracks in a piece of porcelain that somehow made it more beautiful. "They've been talking about this treasure hunt for weeks," she said. Micah insisted on planting decoy clues to trick Rowan. Graham chuckled. "I don't know where they get their scheming tendencies." "Definitely not from me," she said with a mock glare. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the edges of the tablecloth. Somewhere near the hedge, Bryce and Wallace were crouched beside a wrapped box, whispering like co-conspirators. Graham tilted his head. Is that my brother teaching Bryce how to rig the birthday surprise? Wallace has become disturbingly good at Uncle Angie, Elise replied. I caught him and Caleb last week trying to engineer a pulley system for delivering snacks without leaving the couch. Graham laughed, but his throat tightened unexpectedly. Not from sadness, not anymore, but from the sheer fullness of the moment. I used to think legacy was about empire, he said. Buildings, influence, the company's name on a skyline. And now, he squeezed her hand gently. Now, I know legacy is built right here. He gestured toward the lawn where 4 boys were shouting about buried treasure and launching themselves into a world entirely their own. A world built on curiosity, imagination, and the kind of trust only children grant without hesitation. The party wore on. Parents from the neighborhood chatted over lemonade and cupcakes. Elise's co-worker brought a handmade kite, and the boys took turns flying it, shrieking with delight. Graham never strayed far. He helped cut slices of cake, bandaged a scraped knee, even wore a pirate hat when Jude insisted. As the skies softened to lavender, guests trickled out. Elise gathered plates. Graham packed leftover sandwiches into foil. The boys, spent from the day, clustered on the swing bench in matching pajamas, whispering stories only they could understand. Graham stepped onto the back porch. Elise followed. They stood side by side, watching the sky bloom into stars. I still remember that night, Graham said softly. She didn't ask which. She knew. I thought I was losing everything, he continued. Turns out, it was the beginning of everything that mattered. Elise leaned her head on his shoulder. You showed up, she whispered. Every day since. That's what made the difference. He turned to her then, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her face. I don't want this to be separate anymore, he said. Not you, not the boys, not me trying to balance it all. I want us to build one life. Together. Her eyes shimmered. Not with surprise, but with something older, deeper. We already have, she said. But I'd love to make it official. That night, when the house was quiet, Graham walked into the boys' room. 4 tiny chests rose and fell in rhythm. He stood there for a long time, memorizing the sound. The rise and fall, the presence, the gift of time. He bent down and kissed each forehead. Good night, Caleb, he whispered. Good night, Micah. Good night, Rowan. Good night, Jude. They stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Downstairs, Elise was waiting. She handed him a folded piece of paper. Crayon drawings. 5 stick figures, holding hands beneath a house with a crooked chimney. They said it's our family, she said. They wanted you to have it. Graham traced the stick figures with his finger. It's perfect. He looked up, and in that small, worn kitchen, lit only by a single lamp and a dream long thought lost, Graham Whitaker understood the quiet truth he had once missed. It was never about building a fortune. It was about building a life. And finally he had. The story of Graham Whitaker is more than a tale of redemption and rebuilding a family. It's a mirror reflecting what many adults today are quietly grappling with. The constant trade-off between outward success and interconnection. In modern society, we're often swept up in the pursuit of career advancement, financial security, and the illusion of achievement. But when the office lights dim and the stock ticker fades, what remains isn't the rankings or the accolades. It's the eyes we failed to look into, the embraces we missed, and the relationships we assumed could wait forever. Graham represents a man who once had everything, wealth, power, influence, but lost what mattered most, family. His journey challenges us to ask ourselves, what are we really investing in with our time and energy? Ambition is not wrong, and success is not a sin. But when those become the reasons we distance ourselves from the people who love us unconditionally, maybe it's time to pause and reevaluate. In an age where technology connects us to the entire world, being present, truly present, has become increasingly rare. A dinner filled with laughter, reading bedtime stories, saying, I'm here for you. These small moments have become precious, not because they're extravagant, but because they're real. We must ask ourselves, are we working to live or living just to work? The lesson from Graham's story is a gentle but powerful reminder. It's never too late to turn back. No matter how far we've gone or how much time we've lost, if we approach life with honesty, patience, and a commitment to love, we can still reclaim what truly matters: our family. No one is perfect, but everyone deserves a second chance. And sometimes, happiness doesn't come from what we gain, but from what we're willing to let go of in order to hold on to what really counts. We don't need to be millionaires like Graham to understand this. We just need to listen, slow down, and choose what's right, even if it doesn't earn us a bonus or a title. Because the reward is something money can never buy: love, presence, and a home that feels like home. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment. Below, I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.